Shalom, Baruchim Abayim, and welcome to Sheva Impani the Torah to the 70 faces of the Torah and also Sulam Yaakov. This week's Torah portion is Parashat Vayigash, which means, and he drew near. I have subtitled this teaching, Divine Emanation. This teaching actually builds off of a previous teaching which I did for this Torah portion, which is subtitled, Who Am I? So if you paid attention to that teaching, listened to it, watched the video, then some of the things I'll be talking about in this week's teaching will also build upon that. If you have not taken a chance to take a look at the other teaching, I recommend you do so. You can still follow me in this teaching. However, to get a greater understanding of the topics at hand, it is highly recommended to take a look at the other teaching as well. In this week's Torah portion, we know that the primary focus is the reconciliation of Yosef with his family. And a part of that process begins with the two brothers, Yehuda and Yosef, having a face-to-face dialogue. Thus, Vayigash is the concept of drawing near, which is Yehuda drawing near to his brother, to be able to convince him, to persuade him to release Benjamin, back to their father Yaakov, and to take him as a substitution. In a way, Yehuda is performing a tikkun, a rectification for the original damage that he caused back 13 years ago with the actual Michirat Yosef, the sale of Joseph to Mitzrayim. And we see that as Yosef is examining his brothers, as he's seeing that yes, they are doing a tikkun of the damage that they previously done, Yosef can no longer conceal his identity, and he reveals himself. He tells all of the Egyptians to go forth from their presence, and finally he yells out to reveal himself. And what's interesting is that when he reveals himself, we see that basically he wants to know, is his father Yaakov still alive? It's very interesting considering that in his previous correspondence with his brothers, I would say the game or the lesson that he was trying to teach them, they obviously went back to Eretz Israel. They did communicate with their father. They did bring Benjamin back. And so maybe Yosef didn't believe them. Maybe he wanted the raw truth. Is Yaakov still alive? But I believe the Torah is conveying something a little bit deeper over here. Let's take a look at the verse in Bereshit, Genesis 45, verse 3 through 4. It says, after Yosef revealed himself, Vayomer Yosef el Achav, Yosef said to his brothers, Ani Yosef ha'od avichai. I'm Joseph. Is my father still alive? And it says afterwards, his brothers velo yachilu achav la'anot oto. They cannot answer him. Why is that? Because they had a great fear of him. There was a great fear. Vayomer Yosef el achav. And so Joseph then said to his brothers, Gishuna elai, please draw near to me. And Vayigashu, and they drew near, Vayomer. And then he says, Ani Yosef, I am Joseph, Achichem asher michartem uti Mitzrayim, whom you sold to Mitzrayim. I am your flesh and blood brother. It's very interesting. However, to understand the meaning of Yosef's words, we need to understand about the essence of Yosef. And this is why I have subtitled this teaching, Divine Emanation. What does that mean? Well, with God's help, we're going to learn that through this shiur. Now, according to Jewish thought, what we call hashkafa, outlook, etc., HaShem governs this world through what is known as the lower Sefirot. And the lower Sefirot, the lower 7 Sefirot specifically, they are known in Aramaic as Arich Anpin, which is based off the Hebrew Arich Anpin. Which we translate as long suffering, but it means the long face that's Kabbalistically known. And here is a rough depiction of a sketch and artwork that is contained in many, many Kabbalistic works, and it depicts the face of a man, Now, one of the things you have to understand that these are all metaphorical in nature, these illustrations. And we see in Aramaic at the very top, there's the depiction of the head, referring to the moach, which is the brain, but in Aramaic, it has a term called Atik Yomin, which is a term that refers to Yotik is Ancient of Days, as it's known Yoman in Aramaic, as it's referred to in the book of Daniel. But then we have down below that Arich Anpin, which refers to the countenance of the face. And I'm not going to get into all the complexities. However, I've talked about this in previous shiurim before, specifically dealing with the klipa of Esav. So for those of you who may be new and have not watched all my teachings, I recommend you to get a beginner's lesson into some Kabbalistic expressions and things of that nature to go take a look at that teaching. But we see here that this is an illustration, and it's all basically metaphorical. Nothing is to be taken literal whatsoever. Okay, so what we see here is that HaShem governs the world through, in Kabbalistic thought, through what we know as the lower seven Sefirot, which are called Arich Anpin. Okay, and once again, in Aramaic or Hebrew, it's called Arich Anpin. I'll get to that a little bit later. Now, the 10 Sefirot in total, they are the medium that God uses to control the hidden and revealed parts of creation. The Sefirot limit the infinite quality of God's light and express a contained aspect of his power. The Sefirot are what we consider divine emanations, which God reveals himself to man. And there are two different schools of thought in the Kabbalah. Okay, we have basically the Arizal, Lorianic Kabbalah. Okay, that's one school of thought as well. And then we also have the Ramak, okay, who's also preceded the Arizal. These are two different schools, and they're somewhat the same, but however different. Okay, and time does not allow me to get into that right now. It's not that it's very complicated. I think people make it more complicated than what it is, possibly because they are not familiar with a lot of the jargon that's used in these Kabbalistic texts. And a lot of them over-mysticize these texts. Okay, pretty much the Sefirot are a psychological tool in understanding man's relationship with Hashem, which is based upon the conscious and subconscious mind. And yes, it's also plugged into the actual construct of how this world is created from a physics or quantum mechanics level. All these are integrated as one, and therefore an individual who has a proper understanding of science and mysticism, spirituality, they're able to properly explain these things with the help of God. Now, the Sefirot are not entities that are distinct from their emanator, which would imply a duality or plurality in God, like what is taught in parts of Christianity. Rather, they are various phases and levels of God revealing himself to man. And so they constitute the inner structure of each of the higher spiritual worlds emanating or concretizing in this lower physical world down here. And they also account for the dynamic interactions that take place in each of the worlds. So this would, in physics, when you talk about hyperstrings and things of that nature, things that are not always detectable by our physical eye or ear, our five senses, but are beyond that. Things can be detected with, let's say, technological devices and things of that nature, but they correspond to other spiritual dimensions. Now, the need for the Sefirot is based on the premise that God desired a relationship with man. Were God to create the world by means of his infinite light, okay, his or-hagunus, as it's called, man would have no conception of his creator since he has no grasp of the infinite. And so by forming the world through the Sefirot, mankind can have a glimpse of the hand of God, which is vitalizing creation. Now, when you take a look at the word Sefirot in Hebrew, it's very interesting because Sefirot comes from the word sapphire, which means sapphire. And that alludes to the concept of luminosity. So also it's interesting is Sefirot comes from the word lesaper. Lesaper, it means to tell a sipor, to literally tell a story, to tell a narrative. And this is why on a very, very deep level, the narratives of the Chumash that we read while Scholars debate the authenticity, if there physically existed a Moshe Rabbeinu or David HaMelech in the Tanakh, things of that nature. We're not just concerned about the historical narrative. We also understand that these contain deep allegories for which the Creator reveals Himself through the different personalities that are contained within inside those Parashiot. And so the Sefirot also correspond to those personalities, as we'll see with God's help in His teaching. The Sefirot are vehicles through which God reveals His light and luminosity to the world in a manner that they can relate to. Now, once again, the 7 Sefirot, the lower 7, that is in Aramaic called the Arich Anpin, they correspond to the 7 Tzaddikim, who are none other than Avraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, Yosef, Aharon, Moshe Rabbeinu, and also David HaMelech. Each Tzaddik embodied a specific midah or attribute of HaShem. Now, a midah we call attribute in English, but that's not what it means in Hebrew. A midah literally means a container, like a vessel that holds something. Okay, they contain some spark of godliness that revealed an emanation of HaShem into this world. And so due to their discipline and their commitment, the 7 Tzaddikim are considered a part of what we call the divine chariot, or in Hebrew it's called the Merkava. And we read in the Midrash, this concept is talked about in Bereshit Rabbah 47:6. Amar Reish Lakish says, Ha'avot hein hein ha-Merkava, that the fathers, alluding to Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, they serve as a chariot for HaShem. So what this indicates is that the Shekhinah, or the divine presence of God, it only rests upon us to the extent that we permit it to. In other words, if our observance of the mitzvot do not conflict with a certain taiva, a passion, a desire, whether that's for money, for fame, for food, or a certain lust, then whatever extent that weakens that conflict with our dedication to the will of Hashem, the Shekhinah cannot dwell upon us. And this is also a deeper reason behind the different prophets having specific revelations. Some revelations that they saw were greater than others. Why is that? As the Rambam tells us, that depending upon the actual individual consecration of that specific Navi would determine the actual revelation they receive from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So it's the same thing when it comes to a person experiencing divine presence. It all is contingent upon an individual. It's their condition, okay? How they use their free will, okay? How they consecrate themselves to Hashem. Now, nothing is automatically given to say that if a person fasts a specific amount of days, that they're going to be the next Moshe Rabbeinu, even though that should be a target goal for individuals wanting to be on the same dargah or level with God. However, we see that every individual has a case-by-case basis. For example, Yehezqel ben Buzi, the prophet Ezekiel, his revelation of Hashem did not come until after 5 years of exile. So a lot of people, they pick up the prophets, they think, wow, this individual had great communication with Hashem, but someone like Ezekiel did not actually receive any communication with Hashem, and he was a Kohen like Yeshayahu and like Yirmiyahu, they were Kohanim. But he still didn't receive any type of communication with Hashem, Nevuah, until 5 years after being in Galut. I mean, think about that. Would one still continue to commit themselves to the Torah in a place of exile? Okay? And after the aftermath of destruction of Yerushalayim and things of that nature? Well, Ezekiel stayed committed, and obviously God eventually spoke to him. But it took 5 years afterwards. So everything is contingent upon the individual. In Kabbalistic thought, the person who is the bearer of the Shekhinah is called a Merkava. It's called a chariot. A royal chariot can bear the king only if it is free of any external burdens. So if you fill it with extraneous burdens, then it will have no room for the king. A royal chariot with no room for the king is not a chariot. It's a wagon. It's just something that you schlep things from point A to point B. Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov are God's chariot on earth because it was through them that his Shekhinah descended into this realm. And because they negated themselves, a concept that's called Bitul Hayesh, they nullified their egos as individuals, they were able to totally absorb godliness and become the bearers of God's presence. So in Kabbalistic thought, each righteous figure corresponds to an emanation of HaShem. This is important. Once again, Avraham represents Chesed, Yitzhak is Givurah, and we know Yaakov is Tiferet, the harmonious balance between the two. And what I want to point out while I'm on the topic here about Givurah, I want to mention something, because a lot of people don't really understand what that means. A lot of people understand Givurah sometimes translated as severity, or it's also called Midat Hadin. It's the attribute of judgment. And a lot of people think it has a negative connotation, but that's not absolutely true. Givurah, while it's translated as judgment, it actually implies uncompromising moral strength, leading to total subjugation of one's Yetzer Hara. Over in the Mishnah, Chazal asks a question about who was a person who possessed Givurah, who was a Gibor. And they said, it's the individual who learns to conquer their Yetzer Hara. We read in Pirkei Avot 4:1, Ben Zoma Omer, Ben Zoma asks a question, Ezehu Gibor, who's a Gibor, who possesses Givurah? Hakovesh et Yitzro. It's one who subdues his Yitzro, his Yetzer, his inclination. As Shnei Amar, it says in Proverbs 16:32. He that is slow to anger, tov Arich Anpin. There's that phrase from the 13 attributes corresponding to Aramaic term Arich Anpin, as I was just talking about. That individual, migibor umoshel berucho milched ir. That individual is able to rule his spirit, is mightier than a person who can conquer a city. So the reason why Givurah is perceived as a form of judgment is that when a person fails to embody the attribute of Givurah and overcoming the Yetzer Hara, they are exposed to a greater degree of judgment. And tragically, this is what happened to Esav. Esav was a full embodiment of Givurah. As I explained in the Klipa of Esav teaching, Yaakov represented one aspect of Tiferet, the internal part. Esav was to represent the external part. Both of them derived from this root. Esav had a greater power and potential than his brother Yaakov. However, he failed. Okay, he failed to overcome. And because of that, he was exposed to a greater degree of judgment, which is why we see written throughout the Tanakh, God mentioning his war with Esav, the kingdom of Edom. So Yaakov, once again, is considered the attribute of Tiferet. And then if we continue on, we know Yosef, on the Sefirot, he's considered the attribute of Yesod, which is directly below Tiferet. And Yesod is symbolic of the sanctity of the covenant. And as we'll see later, that the Sefirot also correspond the outline of man. So Yesod corresponds the area of the male member, which is the sign of the covenant. Aharon and Moshe Rabbeinu, they are considered the attribute of Netzach and Hod. While David HaMelech, he is considered the attribute of Malchut, which is kingdom, because by subjugating himself to Hashem, David became worthy of being the king of Israel, if you will. He was the visible representation, the individual representing God, okay? And so this is also why when you get into the different madrigot of the Sanhedrin, who are called by the singular plural title Elohim, you see that there is this different, if you will, I would say dichotomy between the levels of the king and also the Sanhedrin, okay, when it came to representing emanations of Hashem. Now, to be worthy of being a Merkava, being the chariot of Shekhinah, an emanation of God, each of these Tzaddikim were tested in ways related to their specific essence. For instance, Avraham, we know he went through 10 tests, but a lot of people overlook what really made him the embodiment of Chesed, how he was that expression of God. He became the embodiment of Chesed when he prayed to Hashem not to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. How did that allow him to become the embodiment of Chesed? Well, Sodom and Gomorrah was the antithesis of Chesed. They were selfish. They were very stingy. Okay, a lot of people think that they were a wicked city that was steeped in, let's say, homosexuality. They may have been involved in that type of lifestyle, just like many nations are today, but that's not the reason why God destroyed them. Rather, as you read in the book of Ezekiel, and the way Chazal bring it down, is that these people were very wealthy, but they were very selfish. They didn't believe in giving anything out, food and shelter to those who are less fortunate, because they believe if you were born under a certain mazal and you were destined to live impoverished or to be cursed, then it wasn't their responsibility to help you. So they were selfish, the opposite of chesed. Now, when it comes to the Akedat Yitzhak, the binding of Isaac, Yitzhak became the embodiment of Gevurah when he was willing to give up his life for HaShem. Okay, he was willing to lay down at all costs, no debating, no selfishness within him. He was willing to comply with the letter of the law for God. Yaakov, he became the embodiment of Tiferet when he contended with Esav. He had to fight his inner Esav, which also allowed him to fight his uncle Lavan. That's why he went to 20 years in exile, in order to overcome and rectify the darkness that was in him. The same impurity that took over Esav could have took over Yaakov. And so Yaakov's trials revolved around the fine line dividing truth from falsehood. Yosef, he became the embodiment of Yesod when he was thrown into the moral depravity of Mitzrayim and he was faced with great temptation. And so for today's teaching, I would want us to focus on the attribute of what Yosef represents, which is Yesod. The Torah tells us that Yosef was blessed with good looks. We read in Bereshit 39:6 back in Parashat Vayigash, it says, Vayihi Yosef Yefei To'ar. Yosef was handsome. He was a vifei mareh. He was a good-looking guy. He was pleasant to look at, right? He was good. God blessed him with good looks. Now, Chazal taught that as a youth, Yosef was obsessed with his good looks. It's one thing, to acknowledge, hey, I'm a decent-looking mensch here, but he was obsessed with it. And we read in the Midrash, Reshit Rabbah 4:7. It says, the verse states over here, Yosef was 17 years old. Why? Okay, so why is he called a Na'ar then, a youth? Well, the Torah describes him as a youth because he would do adolescent things, such as preen his eyes or walk with an arrogant walk, and he would also groom his hair. And so Yosef really, if social media existed back then, he would have been one of these social media individuals that constantly had the phone out, taking pictures of himself, posing in different directions, and uploading it to all the social media sites today. And so pretty much he was very arrogant. Now, beauty, it's a mixed blessing. Why do I say that? Over in Masechet Tanit, we learn a fascinating story about Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananiah and his encounter that he had with the daughter of the Roman Empire, the Roman Emperor's daughter, And in this story, the daughter of the Roman Emperor is offended by the unattractive looks of Rabbi Yehoshua, that he's a man that possesses great wisdom. But man, this guy is oogly looking. Not ugly, but oogly. Only a mother could love the face of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananiah. We see here in Tanit 7a. It says, as the Kaiser's daughter said to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananiah, she says, whoa, glorious wisdom, which is a reference to the Torah, is in an ugly vessel. He responded to her, does your father put his wine in earthenware vessels, which are old and ugly, right? She said to him, but what else should we put the wine in? He said to her, you who are nobility should put your wine in vessels of gold and silver. And so it says she went and reported this suggestion to her father. He put the wine in vessels of gold and silver, and it became sour. When his servants came and told him that the wine had spoiled, he asked his daughter, who told you to do this? She answered him, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananiah. His servants called for Rabbi Yehoshua, and Kaiser asked him, what did you tell my daughter to do this? Or why did you tell my daughter to do this? Rabbi Yehoshua responded. He says, listen, as she spoke to me, I replied to her. In other words, that just as the emperor's daughter found it surprising that wisdom could be contained in an unattractive person, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananiah wanted her to learn that just as wine is preserved in ugly earthenware vessels, Likewise, the Torah is better preserved in similar vessels. And so it goes on to say afterwards, Kaiser's daughter then asks, but there are beautiful people who are also learned. There are other Talmud Chacham who look handsome. Rabbi Yehoshua answered, well, if these handsome scholars would be detestable in appearance, they would be even more learned. Fascinating. What we learn from this is that the degree of a person's, I hate to use the term scholarship because it sounds too academic, but a person's ability to comprehend and to internalize Torah is not related to his beauty, but to his attitude towards beauty. A beautiful person who has a contemptuous attitude towards beauty will not be swayed by his good looks to become proud and arrogant. And so beauty brings with it great trials and temptations, which can easily drag its bearer down and make him incapable of acquiring the wisdom of Torah. And so the Torah tells us that while Yosef was faced with trials and temptations in Mitzrayim, HaShem was always with him. God was blessing him with great success. We read in Genesis 39:21, Vayi Adonai et Yosef vayit elav chesed vayitein chino. And Hashem was with Yosef, and he imbued him with grace be'nei sar beit hasohar, and the eyes of the prison warden. And this was after the Potiphar's wife attempted to falsely accuse him of taking advantage of her, and he was thrown into the maximum penitentiary in Mitzrayim, in which Hashem gave him great blessing and success. And so what we see here is that Yosef was given special grace and success from Hashem. Why? Well, because he did not fall victim to the moral depravity of Mitzrayim. Now, while Yosef guarded his soul in Mitzrayim, he was not without his struggle to fight off temptation. Okay? The Torah tells us that on the day that Potiphar's wife attempted to have relations with him, it was on a day that nobody happened to be at the property. Very interesting and very strange at the same time. We read here in Breshit, Genesis 39:11, Vayhi kehayom hazeh, vayavo habaita la'asot melacheto. And it was on that day he came to the house to do his work. Ve'ein ish, and there was no person, me'anshe habayit, of the members of the household, sham babayit, there in the house. Now let's think about this. Up to this point, Potiphar's wife has been trying to seduce Yosef, okay? Wearing her most seductive lingerie, her most enticing perfume, wearing her most, sexy makeup, whatever you want to call it. Maybe trying to DM him in his Instagram account. Who knows what they had back then? So why would Yosef put himself in a situation where he would be alone with a married woman, especially a woman who was trying to seduce him? Chazal tell us that the day that Yosef almost fell victim to Potiphar's wife was a pagan holiday. And there's two opinions which we'll get into what type of holiday, but everybody was out and about, and they were all indulging in some type of immoral lifestyle. And so on this day, when everyone in the nation went out to celebrate, both Yosef and Potiphar's wife, they chose to have this day to be alone to have an intimate encounter. In other words, Yosef was bound to give in to the sexual temptation. And so as an excuse to go to the property, Yosef was going to go check out Potiphar's accounting books, because after all, he was master of everything in Potiphar's house. To make it seem legitimate why he was there, it was because he was going to actually go do some work. And so we read here, going to the Gemara, Masechet Sotah, we'll read from here in the Midrash, 36b, the Gemara says that this teaches that both Yosef and Potiphar's wife stayed in the house as they attended to perform a matter of sin, an avera. Now, with regard to the phrase, when he went to the house to do his work, Rav and Shmuel engaged in the dispute with regard to its meaning. One says it means that he went into the house to do his work, literally, right? And one says, no. He entered the house in order to fulfill his sexual needs with her, because that's work as well. Okay, it's just a idiomatic expression. Okay, so it goes on to say afterwards. It says, Hayom Yom Hagam Haya. On that day was a festival, and they all went out to the house of idol worship, to Avodah Zarah, and she told them that she was sick and she could not go. And so she said to herself, I have no day in which Yosef will attend to me like this day. Now, if we go to the Midrash kind of picks up off of what the Gemara is saying and explores it a little bit more. We read here in Breshit Rabbah 87a. Rav Yehuda said it was on the day that the Nile overflowed its banks, and everyone went out to see it, but Yosef did not go. And now, if you know anything about the Egyptian system of Avodah Zarah, it's attributed that Paro believed that he was like a god who would go, he created the Nile and everything. And this is one of the funny things about Moshe Rabbeinu and Aharon confronting Paro later in the Chumash Shemot, is that they confronted him while he was in the Nile. And so the Midrash mentions that Paro, he basically presented himself as a god who created the Nile. And so as a god, obviously you don't have any issues or needs like a human being does. So in the morning, Pharaoh used to go down and he would relieve himself, go to the bathroom in the Nile. So it was at this moment Moshe shows up and says, well, sorry, I hate to bother you on your bathroom break, but so much for a god, right? So it's kind of like a tongue-in-cheek statement there. So nonetheless, the Midrash says, well, they went down because this was a part of their idol worship. And however, we see the view from Rabbi Nehemiah says, oh, there was a performance at the local theater, the movie theater, on that day, and everyone went to see the performance. It was still a form of Avodah Zarah, just some type of theatrical performance of it. But Yosef did not go. And it says, rather, he entered the house to do his work, to calculate the accounts of his master, his cheshbonot shel rabo. So this was a backup plan once again to basically use as an excuse, as it says in Masechet Sotah, to allow himself to get in proximity. And this kind of shows you how the Yetzer Hara works in a person, right? You're fighting this temptation, this beautiful woman is trying to seduce you, you're trying to avoid it, but the inclination is strong. And so, Potiphar's wife was calling to him like the crack was calling the Pookie, for those who have ever seen the movie. Okay, you know what I'm talking about. And he can't take it. He's just like, okay, well, let me go and do some work, right? Knowing that he puts himself in proximity to her. So Chazal tell us that to refrain from sinning. Yosef saw an image of his father Yaakov, and it woke him up, disturbed him. And immediately he fled outside, as the Torah described, right, when she grabbed his garment. And when he fled outside, he went to an area and dug his hands into the ground. And that by digging his hands in the ground, he emitted sperm from his fingernails. We read here, continuing in Masechet Sotah 36b, and it says, immediately, and the rabbis, in Hebrew, there's no vulgar language. Can be vulgar connotations with Hebrew words, but there's no curse words like we have in English. So that's why in modern Hebrew, there's a lot of borrowed language when a person wants to use derogatory language. Not saying that you should. But to describe Yosef's sexual arousal, per se, the rabbis applied a verse from Genesis 49:24 that says, Miyad vateshev be'etan, kashto, and immediately his bow returned firm. In other words, it's describing Yosef, when he had an erection, So excuse me for those who may be offended by it, but that's what the rabbis are showing us here. The guy was sexually active, And so Rav Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Meir, this means that his bow, his male member, returned to its strength. He overcame his desire, right? He snapped out of it. And the verse then continues afterwards in Genesis 49:24, and which says, and the arms of his hands were made supple. But that means, the sages say, is that he dug his hands into the ground and his semen was emitted between his fingernails. Now you'll see I have highlighted here in yellow, it says, Vaya fozu zero'e yadav. What does that mean? We're going to get back in a minute, because if we go to the Midrash I just quoted, it also piggybacks off of the Gemara, and it alludes to the same thing. Rabbi Yitzchak said, his seed scatter and exit from between his fingernails, as it says in Genesis 49:24. Vayafozu zero'e yadav. But it's translated in many English texts, and his arms were gilded. Now I left the asterisk there. Let me explain how the rabbis understood that as him spilling or emitting seed from his fingernails, which seems to be crazy. Like, what the heck are the rabbis smoking on? I want some. All right, no, I'm just joking. But what's going on over here? Let me explain, because we're dealing with Hebrew. The verse here in Genesis 49:24 can actually be read, and the seed was dispersed through his hands. Okay? The word that you see over here, vayofosu, okay, is actually read as vayafosu. So that means, and they were dispersed. Obviously, you see there's a change, vayafozu, that has a zayin there at the end. And then it's being read by the rabbis as vayafosu. It's a sadi. Now, if you know Hebrew, you'll know that certain letters are able to be interchangeable. And the letters zayin and sadi are interchangeable at certain times. Why? Because they're pronounced with the teeth. The aleph bet, the Hebrew alphabet, it actually emanates from 5 parts of the mouth. So to pronounce certain words, some words are pronounced from the palate, some are from the tongue, some are from the teeth, some are from the throat. They're called gutturals, which some are more pronounced than others. You have silents that are also from the throat, like the aleph and the ayin. So if actually you listen to somebody very Israeli or Iraqi, or even from any parts of Yemen, things of that nature, they pronounce the ayin accurately, okay, like how it is in Arabic. But American Jews that speak Hebrew, they won't always do it, just because of the accent, that's it. So these are interchangeable. Now, when we take a look at the word zeroeh in Genesis 49:24, that's seen as a form as zera. And zera means seed, or it can mean sperm. Now, I know what you're thinking. Okay, great explanation, phenomenal exegesis. But how in the world could sperm drip from the fingernails of Yosef? Come on. Are you serious now? What do the rabbis mean by that? Well, get ready to put your seatbelts on, kids. We're going to go into something deep here. Contrary to the biological understanding of the male body, man's sperm is more than a physical substance that is generated in the lower part of the body. At its root, sperm is a spiritual energy that originates from the seat of the soul in the brain. When the sperm begins to descend, it's still in its original spiritual state, or the energy that creates it. However, once it reaches the lower extremities of the body, it then becomes a physical substance. Now, this is very important to understand. And we'll go into a little anatomy here, because it's not so far-fetched on some type of mystical jargon that's not relatable to the anatomical makeup of the male body. On either side of the thalamus in the head, there's a gland that is called the pineal. Now, the pineal is cone-shaped and secretes a yellowish golden type fluid. Now, the pituitary body that's opposite of it is ellipsoid in its shape, and it contains a whitish secretion like a milky substance. That's usually the substance that is mostly noted with sperm. Now, the fluids that are found in both of these bodies come from the same source that is called the claustrum. And you see it exactly here on this image. Now, what is claustrum? Claustrum actually literally means a barrier. It separates. The fluid which flows down from the claustrum, it separates, part going into the pineal gland and part into the pituitary. And these function as some type of special laboratories actually in your head, at least in the male head. And therefore differentiate the fluid from the claustrum, and it takes on the colors of either the yellowish pineal or the whitish of the pituitary. And so the yellowish fluid of the pineal has electrical properties, while the whitish fluid of the pituitary has magnetic properties. Now, if this fluid reaches the lower part of the body, it produces what we know as sperm. This is important because the electric and magnetic properties contained in the sperm are essential for procreation. Obviously, you also got to get the woman when she's ovulating and she drops her seed, which is the egg. And together, the zygote and everything that combines it, the wonders of life. Now, what happens if a man does not release seed? If a man does not emit seed, meaning he releases sperm for procreation, or chasas chalila, wastes his seed on other pleasures per se, then that fluid changes its chemistry once it's mixed. And once this chemistry takes place, the fluid becomes less dense. And then it travels back up the spinal column via the cerebrospinal fluid, very similar like the way mercury is in a thermometer. And what happens is it travels up until it rests in the area that we call the solar plexus. Now think about that term, solar plexus. What does it mean? The solar plexus is a collection of two bundles of nerves. In the medical field, they call it the ganglion. And therefore they are intertwined and they pass each other as a central location in the abdomen. Once in the solar plexus, the fluid charges itself for 2.5 days. Why 2.5 days? What does that mean? The 2.5 days are related to the phases of the moon when it passes through the constellations, specifically the sun sign. And the sun sign is the constellation you were born under. Gemini, Virgo, Aries, etc. And so during this time, the fluid in the solar plexus, assuming a person is living godly, they're living righteous, and they're living a healthy life, taking care of their body, their mind, etc., is being charged by the electromagnetic energy of the sun and moon. This is why it's called solar plexus. Okay? Solar plexus, it's the energy that is contained within. This is also why people have experiences with, they call their third eye, from the pineal. All this is related to the energy of that special fluid. And so, friends, the drops of sperm that emitted from the fingernails of Yosef were uprooted from the pure seed that originated in his brain and rested in his solar plexus. And so the sperm that emitted from his fingernails was definitely not physical sperm. The rabbis were not that out there, okay? This is the secret behind Chazal's interpretation of Genesis 49:24, where they read the verse, and as his hands dripped seed. That's why we could read it differently. Now, while Yosef may not have been physically intimate with Potiphar's wife, Baruch HaShem, okay, and which would have caused him to spill physical seed, the Zohar teaches that the souls derived from Yosef's spiritual seed that came from his fingers were none other than the Asera Harugei Malchut, the 10 righteous martyrs who were killed by the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago. And Masechet Brachot, where Moshe Rabbeinu is shown Rabbi Akiva and the yeshiva of Rabbi Akiva, and how well learned Rabbi Akiva is in the Torah Moshe. Moshe is shown how Rabbi Akiva is gruesomely killed by the Romans. And Moshe is very, very disturbed. And he asks Hashem, how can you allow such a thing to happen? Hashem responds to Moshe and says, shh, sheket, keep silent. This decree is what has risen, it is what is arisen out of my thoughts. We read here in Masechet Melachot 29b, Moshe said before God, Rabbono Shel Olam, Master of the Universe, you have shown me Rabbi Akiva's Torah, now show me his schar, his reward. God said to him, return to where you were. Moshe went back and he saw that they were weighing Rabbi Akiva's flesh in a butcher market, a makulin as it's known as. Rabbi Akiva was tortured to death by the Romans. In fact, he was crucified and his skin was filleted with what was called a cat of nine tails. And he died actually quoting the Shema Ve'ahavta. And so Moshe said before him, Master of the Universe, this is the Torah and this is its reward? And God said to him, be silent. And now in English, we translate this, attention arose before me. But literally, actually in the Hebrew, this arose from my thoughts. The wording of Hashem's answer to Moshe's question is related to the 10 martyrs and the spiritual sperm of Yosef that originated from his brain. What we learn from this is that the mind of Yosef corresponded to the mind of Hashem. Yosef brought those souls into existence. Now, Kabbalistically, the death of the Asara Harugei Malchut were considered an atonement for Yosef's pagam of emitting that spiritual seed. And this Kabbalistic interpretation is based actually on the developed rabbinical concept of the death of the 10 martyrs, whose death atoned for sins were related to Yosef's 10 brothers who betrayed him. So their deaths ultimately served for the pagam of Yosef's brothers. But it's a developed idea that came after the Roman Empire started to outlaw Judaism, and they wanted the Jews to venerate the chair of Rome, okay, the Roman Empire. The Roman emperor who perceived himself as half God, half man. You know, God manifested in the flesh, which is where Christianity gets their theology from. Now, when Yosef revealed himself to his brothers, the Torah mentions that he asked if his father was still alive, as I mentioned at the beginning of this teaching. Strange request. You would think, obviously, the father is alive. But there's more beneath the surface. We read here in Genesis 45:3. Vayomer Yosef el achav ani Yosef ha'o avi chai. I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? Yosef's question about Yaakov was related to the spiritual connection between him and his father. As part of the 7 tzaddikim that make up the Arich Anpin, Yaakov and Yosef represent the sanctity of Torah. The Torah describes Yaakov as a ish tam, as an innocent man who dwelled in the tents of Torah, while Yosef was a pillar of Yesod, which is the sanctity of Brit HaKodesh, of the Holy Covenant. Genesis 25:27, Parashat Toledot, V'Yaakov ish tam Yoshev ohalim. Now, it doesn't say ohel in the plural, it says ohalim, in tents. Tents of Torah. What we learn about this connection of Yaakov and Yosef, is that success in the Torah is dependent on the sanctity of Brit HaKodesh, of the Holy Covenant, of moral purity. And the second blessing of Bircha HaMazon, the blessing that we say, grace after meals, we thank HaShem for his covenant that is sealed in our flesh, in our male member. We read here, Nodeh lecha Adonai Eloheinu. We thank you, HaShem, our God, for your parceling out as a heritage to our fathers, a land that is desirable, good, and spacious, for your bringing us out, HaShem, our God, from Eretz Mitzrayim, the land of Egypt, and redeeming us from the house of Avadim, of bondage, of servitude. V'abalitecha shechatamta biv sarenu. For your covenant you have sealed in our flesh. The primary traits of Yaakov and Yosef were inseparably connected, as well as interdependent. When Yosef revealed himself and asked if his father was still alive, ha'od avi chai, he wanted to know that while he was gone all those years, was Yaakov's attribute of Tiferet still alive? Was it spiritually still there? The Midrash teaches that when Yosef told his brothers to draw near to him, that he showed them the mark of his circumcision. Genesis, Bereshit Rabbah, 93:10. Gishu na elai, vayigishu. Draw near, they drew near. Herei lahem et hamila. And he showed his brothers his circumcision. Very strange way to reconcile with your brothers after 13 years. Like, hey guys, psst, please come close. Now, obviously, the Midrash's statement of Yosef showing his brother's circumcision contains a deeper meaning, all right? It was not anything like what it appears upon the Parashat. Yosef was revealing to his brothers that he represented the sanctity of the Torah, and despite the moral corruption in Mitzrayim, he had remained unblemished. And so as the pillar of Yesod, Yosef represented the sanctity of the Holy Covenant, which was bound to Yaakov, who was the pillar of Torah. And so by exposing Yosef to the immorality of Mitzrayim, the brothers had actually endangered the Torah of their father. Now, on an allegorical level, Yosef's encounter with his brothers, revealing to them the sign of the Brit HaKodesh, really represents the sanctity of the soul and the desires of the body. When a person allows himself to be exposed to the desires of the body, which is Mitzrayim, which is Mitzar, restriction, they risk the purity of their soul, of limiting their spiritual potential. This is why when we study these parshiot, we have to look at these allegorical meanings. Now, in the previous teaching on the Torah portion, I explained that when the Torah mentioned Yosef recognizing his brothers but they did not recognize him, it was due to a lack of spiritual seichel or comprehension. Genesis 42:8. Vayigash Yosef et achav. Yosef recognized his brothers. Vehim lo hikiruhu, but they did not recognize him. Now, according to the Midrash on this verse, the reason why Yosef's brothers, they did not recognize him is because, he had a zakan, he had a beard. He's mature now. It's 13 years later. Bereshit Rabbah 91:7. And therefore the rabbi said, because they did not leave him bearing the mark of a beard. All right, when they sold him, he didn't have a beard. Now, while growing a beard can change the appearance of a person, okay, how they look and things of that nature, once again, the Midrash contains a deeper lesson here. What is that lesson? According to Kabbalah, a man's beard is related to the sanctity of Brit HaKodesh, of the Holy Covenant. In other words, when a person is sanctified in moral purity, there's a correspondence with the beard. In fact, in halakha, in Jewish law, a man who is incapable of fathering children is also incapable of growing a beard. This type of individual in Jewish law is called a saris. Okay? A saris is a male who does not develop secondary sexual characteristics at puberty, or he can have those characteristics move, meaning he becomes like a eunuch. Now, another topic for another day too is about different genders in Jewish law. I know we live in a woke generation today. People say I'm in woke genders, but there's actually different genders. Androgynous figures, a woman like Sarah Imenu who's called an alonit or saris. These are not classified as basically zakar unekeva, as male or females, okay? They're a separate category that Jewish law applies to differently, okay, which is very interesting to get into as well. So this describes a saris. And so a person, there's a genetic pagam there in which they can't produce a child. There's a lack to grow a beard, okay? But what does that mean on a deeper level? Well, from a Kabbalistic perspective, the physical defect of a saris is indicative of a spiritual defect. It's very similar to the Metzorah who has sara'at. That physical manifestation on their skin is from a spiritual pagam. Now, in relation to the Sefirot, as I explained earlier, the Sefirot represent the anthropomorphic configuration of man. That's why it's in the shape of a man. The human body has the shape it does because it reflects the structure of the soul, which in turn reflect the configuration of the Sefirot. All right? Now, in this arrangement, what we see here was called Keter, and I don't have the actual Sefirah on there on the top. Da'at is used interchangeably with it, and that's another topic why. I'm not going to talk about that right now. But Keter is usually identified with the skull, and the skull in the Zohar is called Golgotha. All right? Whereas Chachma and Bina, they're identified with the right and left hemisphere, which, if you want to get on the biological levels I just explained, with the secretion of seed, they correspond to the pineal and the pituitary. All right, and Golgotha representing the thalamus. Now, in his Kabbalistic commentary on Parashat Toledot, the Arizal, Rabbi Yitzhak Lori, he spoke of the partsuf of the Arich Anpin, which literally means extended countenance, okay, which once again corresponds to the 7 Tzaddikim. And once again, Arich Anpin in Aramaic corresponds to the Hebrew term Erech Apayim, which means slow to anger, which refers to one of the Yugimel Midot, the 13 attributes of Hashem from Parashat Kitasa, Exodus 34:6-7. The Arizal taught that the 13 attributes of Chesed, that they are visualized as 13 hairs of the beard of Arich Anpin. That image I showed you guys earlier that had a face, that had a beard on it, that's what these 13 hairs correspond, that they are descending to Chachma. And so each of these hairs, the Arizal explained, is a channel, a rectification in Aramaic that's known as Tekuni Dikna. Now, the chief disciple of the Arizal, Rabbi Chaim Vatal, in his Sha'ar Ruach HaKodesh, he wrote about the mystical kavanot or intentions of entering to Chodesh Elul, teaching the Tikkunei Dikna, or 13 rectifications of the beard, is open during Chodesh Elul. Very interesting piece, and I did not get to add the Hebrew to it, but the translation is here. It says, during the month of Elul, the 13 sources of the 13 rectifications of the beard, which in Aramaic he used the term Tikkunei Dikna, of Atika, are opened, and they are revealed and shine below in the what's called the makif of the brains, or what's called moachin. Moach is singular, okay, in Hebrew. The partsusim, the partsufim is the different unions of the Sefirot, like the lower 7 is like a partsuf, the upper 3 is a partsuf. The Abba, Ima, left and right, and I left there, they correspond, the pineal and pituitary, Chachma, Bina, etc. This is why we have clarified in the beginning of the Idra Zuta, which is dealing with the Zohar, it's a section there from Parashat Ha'azinu, that from outside the brains of Ama, Ima, Chachma, Bina, okay, pituitary, pineal, their lights break forth and shine in the secret of the surrounding light, or what he calls there as the Or Makif. It is there that these 13 rectifications of the supernal beard of Atika become revealed. Now, when a lot of people read these things, they don't really understand what's being said over here. It's a lot of mystical language, but I could tell you the Ari, his chief disciple, Rabbi Vatal, they were ahead of their time. Way ahead of their time, because they understand the inner dynamics of what's happening in man. In the human body, Keter, with its 2 partsufim, okay, which is Atik Yomim and Arich Anpin, correspond to the skull. That's called Golgotha. The what's called, lack of term, intellectual faculties, which I hate to use because it sounds academic and it doesn't really mean that. The partsuf of Chochma and Bina corresponding to Abba and Ima, okay, Chochma, Bina, they correspond to the right and left hemisphere of the brain. So that would be the pineal and the pituitary corresponding Golgotha or the thalamus. The what's called the makif, which literally means surrounding of the 2 brains, the hemisphere, is what's called the dura that develops him. And the dura is actually a medical term that is used when dealing with the study of the brain or the skull. So the flow of the divine life force, based upon what we just read, extends from Arich Anpin to Chochma and subsequently to Bina, which receives from Chochma, giving, receiving, male, female, yada, yada, yada. And so through the channels of hair of Arich Anpin's beard. Now, according to the Arizal, the 13 parts of the beard of Arich Anpin is connected to the facial hair, all right? Which is why very pious Jews don't shave their beards at all, or they'll grow their peyotes actually further out. And I get this all the time. People ask, you don't have peyotes on. Learn your Torah, friend. Okay, Chaver, learn your Torah. These are your peyotes right here. As long as the side of the hair is not marred with a razor, that's your peyote, okay? Yeah, some grow them a little longer, some keep it shorter, all right? I have thinned out through the years on the top up here, obviously having kids. I used to have a nice, lovely set of long hair like Fabio, but you know, I used to keep it in braids back in the day. But right here, so the more pious, the Chidor mitzvah, as it's known, is to grow it all the way out, just like a person grows their beard all the way out. Nothing wrong with keeping a short beard, whether somebody is symbolic of it. Just understand what you're doing and know why you're doing it, okay? So, but this is the reason why people won't shave their beards or shave their sides of their hair to let it grow out. Now, the only problem with the Arizal's explanation is that a man's beard does not grow from his skull, right? It doesn't grow from here. It's like, what does that mean, right? The hair is here. It's not growing from here. Yeah, you have sideburns that grow down, but it doesn't grow. You have your jawbone, it's connected up to your skull. Now, until recently, the skull was viewed basically as nothing more than a passive shell protecting the brain from the outside. This is the way the medical community looked at it. The brain itself, enveloped in a membrane that's called the dura, is actually floating in the cerebral spinal fluid. Remember, that's the same fluid in which the fluid of the pineal and pituitary through the colostrum descends down. If it does not emit for procreation purposes, it descends up into the solar plexus. And therefore, it's floating in the cerebrospinal fluid, filling the space between the door and the skull with no direct connection to the skull. And there is an image that is zoomed in, showing you the actual levels. Why I mention this? Because in 2018, Nature Neuroscience, they released a study teaching how direct vascular channels connect skull bone marrow and the brain surface, enabling myeloid cell migration. And based on this study, the skull is connected with the brain via direct microscopic vascular channels, just as Kabbalah teaches. Fascinating. That's why I said the Arlim are ahead of their time. Because while most people study and they think they're talking some mystical mumbo jumbo, the cosmos out there, they're actually talking about inside of man. Which is why I've explained in my teachings on the Mishkan that all those items at Kelim are a microcosm of man, and man is a microcosm of what's out there in the universe. According to Nature Neuroscience, confocal microscopy, excuse the tongue twist, of the skull or the dura interface reveal myeloid cell migration through microscopic vascular channels crossing the inner skull cortex. These observations point to a direct local interaction between the brain. What does that mean for you guys sitting at home like, It means this. If you take a look at this image, which they shared in that article, you'll see different areas that talk about the bone, the dura, the brain, and you'll see these channels. And what this is pointing out here is that we see that basically vascular channels are being there. That the skull is not just a plate that protects your brain. So this scientific discovery teaches the skull is no longer viewed as a passive shell, right? The skull, as most flat and long bones, contains bone marrow. And so during inflammation, which activates the innate immune system response, bone marrow in the skull produces more, the term is eluding me here, leukocytes. What is that? Leukocytes? Probably someone in the medical field is probably yelling at the monitor right now. Like, get it right, you idiot. It's L-E-U, I think L-E-U-K-C-Y-T-E-S. I think that's how it's spelled. Leukocytes. Excuse me if I'm butchering it. I'm trying to remember offhand. Now, the other innate immune system cells that are transported via the microscopic vascular channels to the brain are used to heal the inflammation. Why is that important? Because any diligent student within the Kabbalah would take note that the hair in Arich Anpin's beard is a symbolic representation for channels through which the attributes of divine mercy, mazel, flow down to accomplish the tikkun or rectification, thus called tikkunei tikkana. And so here what we see with the brain is that the leukocytes, created by the innate immune system in the skull's bone marrow, flowing down through the microvascular channels to the brain to heal, repair, and rectify the damage, let's say, caused by, God forbid, a stroke or inflammation, do exactly the same thing that we find in the writings of the Ari and Rabbi Chaim Vital, etc. Now this is powerful because in the quote that I just mentioned from Rabbi Chaim Vital, he mentioned that the 13 rectifications of the beard are open. These channels, the beard is just a colloquial term, are open. These 13 channels are open when? During Chodesh Elul. Think about that. What is Chodesh Elul? It's Chodesh Teshuvah. On the 1st of Elul, we begin our, if you follow the Nusach Sephardi, you start focusing on basically prayers of Teshuvah a little earlier, okay? And therefore, Slichot begins at that time, where in the Ashkenaz, you do it a Shabbat before Rosh Hashanah. And so, Chodesh Elul is Chodesh Teshuvah. Ani ledodi v'dodi li, and to my beloved is my beloved to me. The king is in the field, and all these other beautiful, spiritual, poetic expressions used to return to God. When a person enters Chodesh Elul with kavanah, as Rabbi Chaim Vital taught, to draw near to HaShem, they are using the energy of their thoughts. And as I explained before, when the electric and magnetic properties contained in the fluid that produces sperm changes into a less dense fluid and rises up your cerebral spinal to the solar plexus, that fluid charges itself for 2.5 days. The 2.5 days are related to the phases of the moon passing through the constellations of the sun sign. And during this time, the fluid in the solar plexus, assuming a person is living righteous and holy and committed to HaShem and His Torah and are living in health, is being charged by the electromagnetic energy of the sun and moon. Chodesh Elul, Kiddush HaChodesh, the new moon, marks the time we restore ourselves to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The soul is becoming recharged. The thoughts are being recharged. And yes, believe it or not, with the preservation of seed, one can actually reverse aging on themselves. Eyesight, teeth, etc., bone density, etc. And so if one enters the stage of teshuvah properly, they allow themselves to experience the tikkunei dikana flow from within. Not from out there, it's from within. The fact that Yosef had a beard and his brothers were not able to recognize him because he had one, it's not because he just physically had one. It's a remez that due to his consecration of remaining pure in the midst of the immorality of Mitzrayim, Yosef's nature was transformed by the purity of his machshavot, his thoughts. His beard was symbolic of the chesed of HaShem flowing in his life. And so when Yaakov finally learned that Yosef was still alive, he rejoiced. And the Torah says that he mentioned before he would die, he would need to see his son. We read here in Genesis 45:28. Vayomer Israel Rav old Yosef bini chai. How great, how abundant my son Joseph is alive. Therefore, I'm going to go travel to him. And he says, I need to see him b'terem amut, before I die. Now the Midrash comments on this verse teaching that these words refer to Yosef's spiritual power, meaning that while Yosef had undergone many trials and temptations, he maintained a high level of purity and piety. Bereshit Rabbah 94:3. Yaakov was saying here, Rav chocho shel Yosef bini, how great is the spiritual strength of my son Yosef. For many troubles beset him over the year, and he still remains steadfast, bitziko, in his righteousness. Now, once Yaakov arrived in Mitzrayim and he saw Yosef, the Torah mentions that Yaakov told his son, after seeing him, he could finally die. But it's a very interesting phrase he uses over here in Genesis 46:30. Vayomer Israel Yosef. Israel said to Joseph, Amuta hapa'am. Now I can die, after having seen your face, because ki odechacha, you are still alive. Now the English says, now I can die. Not really. The phrase amuta hapa'am literally in Hebrew means I will die this one time. Okay, what does that mean? Yaakov originally feared that with the loss of Yosef, he would die two deaths. One would be a physical death, and the other would be a spiritual death. And so Yaakov's fear of dying a spiritual death was based on the fear of Yosef failing to maintain a pure and righteous life to HaShem while in the darkness of Mitzrayim. It's one thing for Yosef to be physically alive, but it's another thing if he was spiritually dead. Since Yosef lived a consecrated life to HaShem in Mitzrayim, Yaakov was at peace that he would only experience a physical death. Amuta hapa'am ra'oti et panecha ki odecha chai. Just this one time I'm going to die. I'll just be nifter from this physical realm. But the soul continues on. And over in Parashat Vayigash, before physically passing from this world, Yaakov told Yosef, he did not think he would actually see his face, but Hashem not only allowed him to see Yosef's face, but also his grandchildren, Ephraim and Manasseh. Genesis 48:11. Vayomer Israel Yosef rufanecha. Listen, I dare not accept the thought that I would see your face, and yet here, God has shown me even et zarecha, your seed, your offspring. According to Kabbalah, there's a direct connection between man's face and his level of purity in relation to Kiddushat HaBrit. Kiddushat HaBrit, sanctification, the covenant, is offspring, children. Shlomo HaMelech, he taught that a man's wisdom illuminates his face. Kohelet Ecclesiastes 8:1. Chachmat Adam ta'ir panav. A man's wisdom illuminates his face. We know Moshe Rabbeinu coming down from Har Sinai with the second set of Luchot, he shared with a Karen Or, right? Because he was so consecrated. So Yaakov was like, man, it's one thing to see my son alive, but he's also spiritually alive. That his offspring, right, his offspring are from pure seed. And as I explained before, the source of man's seed is in the brain. If a man is pure, his face will shine and radiate like a Sadiq. However, if a man is not pure, then guess what? Evil will appear in his face. We even read this concept in the Gemara, Megillah 28a. Rava said the prohibition against gazing at the likeness of a wicked person is derived from Proverbs 18:5, where it says, Se'et pnei rasha lo tov. It's not good to gaze at the face of a wicked person. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist if you want to go do an experiment and look at the face of individuals involved in certain lifestyles that result in wasting seed to see how they look. They look older than they actually are. Person says, hey, I'm 41. Why do you look like you're 60, my guy? Something's wrong there, okay? On top of maybe drug use, drinking, smoking, not getting enough sleep, that also weighs on a person. Why? Because they're wasting the substance, the energy that comes from that precious fluid contained in them. Because Yosef emerged victorious by overcoming his Yetzer Hara, he became identified as the attribute, the midah of Yesod. And the Torah tells us that Yosef was responsible for providing for all the people in the land when it came time for the famine. Genesis 42:6. Yosef hu hashalit el haaretz. Joseph was the viceroy over the land. He was the provider to all the people of the land. Now, according to Kabbalah, the attribute of Yesod is the conduit through which the divine Shifa, the influx, the flow, the bounty from HaKadosh Baruch Hu reaches into this world. So by withstanding all of his trials and guarding the sanctity of Brit HaChodesh, Yosef became the Sadiq who was the foundation of the world. And what does Shlomo say about the foundation, the righteous? In Proverbs 10:25, Sadiq Yesod Olam. The righteous is the foundation of the world. Yosef ruled and controlled his trait of Yesod, protecting it from the temptations of evil. This capacity to rule over personal lust and desire enabled him to become Moshe b'chol Eretz Mitzrayim, to rule over all of Mitzrayim. He was a Moshel, like the Moshelim that it says in Rabbi Pinkus' teaching brought down by Ramchal Mesilat Yesharim. Bo'u cheshbon cheshbono she'olam. Come, the Moshelim, the conquerors of the Yetzer Hara, say come and do a cheshbon. That's Yosef. The Torah tells us that Mitzrayim was also called the Arvat HaAretz, literally a naked land, which was a euphemism that was known for its immorality and impurity. Like Yosef and the other Tzaddikim, HaShem has given us a special purpose in this world. To fulfill our purpose, we have been granted our own talents, our own capabilities and circumstances. And so the trials and tests that we undergo are an important part of our personal package for spiritual growth and development. They're designed to help us to grow in areas specifically related to our life's mission. That's why in the previous teachings when I talked about the unforeseen circumstances that befell Yosef, the dreams he didn't know he had to go through 13 years of all this mission guys to get to there. And in that 13-year span, he would be faced with great trials and tribulations. But as he prevailed, he became successful. And so with the help of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we can prevail despite the hardships. Rather than breaking us, they will make us stronger or bring us closer to HaShem. And so in the end, like the 7 Tzaddikim, you and my life can also be an emanation of HaShem. That doesn't mean that we are completely divine beings as the Creator Himself in His infinite essence. No, it means that we are a fractal spark of the revelation of God in this world. HaShem reveals His Shekhinah to us like the Avot, like the Merkava, in order to bless and reach others, to draw Him close, a Vayigash, to draw close to Him. And this is why we see here that the righteous are an emanation of God Himself, which is why I call this teaching Divine Emanation. And so with that said, Chavarim, that's going to bring us to a close for my teaching on Parashat Vayigash. I hope that this teaching has been somewhat provoking, thought-provoking, inspiring, motivating, disturbing maybe to some people as well. Make you rethink certain things that you understand with the Torah. And may HaShem use this to help you develop and grow in your relationship with Him and your purpose in this world. And once again, if our organization, our teachings are a blessing to you and you would like to donate, you could find the links directly below the video. And we greatly appreciate your financial donations and support. Thank you very much. If you have any questions pertaining the content from this week's Torah portion, feel free to send me an email. I will answer those in the order that they come in. Until next time, Chavarim, may the God of Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov bless you and your family. Shalom and Kol Tov.